Today I'm speaking with Jason Bradley, and thank you so much for being here to talk with me, Jason. I heard you speak with Benjamin Boyce in a recent interview. I actually heard part of your first one with him and then your second one, and then I went to your channel and started watching some of your videos as well. And is it fair to describe you as an amateur historian?
Yeah, I mean, I would take that description. I'm definitely, I wouldn't, yeah, historian's a loaded term, but I'm very interested in history, and I'm definitely very amateur. So,
Well, something I like about the word amateur is that it actually means somebody who does something for the love of it or for the passion of it,
right.
and as opposed to somebody who's doing it because they're getting paid. And I think there's amateur photographers and amateur historians and people who do something because it's their passion, and it doesn't necessarily diminish the value or the quality of the work that they're doing. And I certainly, in watching your videos and seeing the way that you pull together source materials to demonstrate the period in history that you're talking about or the argument that you're making, it's certainly very in-depth and high quality. So I've
Oh,
really appreciated your work.
thank you very much for saying that. Yeah, it's I just try to present things how I found them, or like how they made sense to me, and try to just reassemble that the best I can, and then usually I have to cut that down to something that is able to put on video. But yeah, it's
Something
typically,
digestible.
yeah, it comes from a big snapshot into a little, and then what you see is, the final product.
Well, one of the reasons, well, I guess the reason why I was so excited to speak with you is that as this as we find ourselves in this cultural moment, I think many people would describe, uh, most of us that I speak with anyway, describe feeling a sort of a shift in how how culture is operating. Education has shifted in a major way. We saw politics take a shift. There are certain ways that we used to critically look at things that are now no longer being done the same way, and we feel like there's this era of propaganda and emotional and political manipulation it's really sort of ramped up over the past several years. And depending on who I'm talking with, I'm also kind of seeing the effect of my own education or my own indoctrination, my own being a product of the culture that I come from, in
Sure.
that people who have not historically seen things the way that I see them, say from a left-wing liberal, left of center perspective, have said, I saw that coming a long time ago. And so there's this sense that the wheels were in motion a long time ago, and yet there's also been a turn where something's kind of accelerated. And I've tended to stay, in terms of these recorded conversations, live streams and stuff, kind of stay out of the conversation around whether it's a conspiracy, whether it's
Sure.
planned, or whether it's something that's more emergent. These cultural forces, is there a they that
Right.
has this kind of, that has been putting this plan in motion? And that's where we come. I kind of have a tendency to see it both ways. I can see how this might be sort of an emergent cultural process, kind of like the fourth turning kind of idea, that things come around, and cultures evolve and change in predictable patterns. But also there does seem to be elements of, um, I guess, orchestration when you look at, say, the UNESCO documents on sex education, and the way that sex is talked about, and sex and gender is suddenly talked about all over the Western world in a new manner. And a lot of your work has been in looking at the people who are the wealthy people who make plans for humanity, and
Yeah.
how that has come to be. And I thought it would be great to have a conversation with you about these issues, and how has this come to be? How have we come to be where we are? And I know that's a giant, broad chunk,
No,
but
yeah. No, it's an excellent line of inquiry, and it's endlessly fascinating to me. That's the rabbit hole I've been climbing down for quite a while. And it's funny, it's like we say, like, things are really turning for the worse now, and then if you rewind 100 years ago, they were saying the same things then. And I think if we find ourselves back in the 1920s, that's where you have the emergence of, like, the Edward Bernays era, and like the end of the World War I, where all of the propaganda really started hitting, the and like there was this huge literacy effort at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th. And the reason being was that the systems were changing. The mechanization was creating less of a demand for uneducated people. And they had to like kind of start a new generation that could read so that they could follow the orders of the new managerial demands. So they're basically, the captains of industry had to look ahead like about 20, 30 years to see, well, if things keep progressing in the way that they're progressing, we don't really need grunts to get into the mines or to do these things, because we have mechanization that's going to take care of that. So what we need is people who can follow orders and are literate and know that. So that's where general education and the entire education system that was born in America comes from that movement. It's like 6 companies that really needed laborers to be able to read instructions. And then into the 20s you get to this and throughout that whole time too, I should mention the intelligentsia and the thought leaders of that era were complaining that we're moving away from, education used to be about preparing someone for life. They would try to give you the tools to prepare you for life. And then the new observation was that education is no longer about preparing you for life. It's about giving you the tools to participate in the life that kind of was chosen for you. And then that got going into the 20s, that got amplified with the, what was that? Oh man, there's a really great quote from Bernays about literacy it wasn't so that it could open people's minds to new cultures and new stuff. It was to turn the minds of people into rubber stamps, so that you can, if you can't read, then you can't read the advertisements. If you can't read the headlines, you can't read the story. So it's like part of controlling the masses was getting this literacy wave out. So it's funny, now we're just 100 years past that, and we've lost all that perspective now, because all of those people are gone, and they're, Bertrand Russell doesn't come up unless you're in some random college course. But the critics of this movement are just gone from our lexicon of thought leaders. And the new thought leaders are just born into this garden of just, it's like perpetuating a cycle of of control that is just tightening. It's just a tightening and a tightening. And then now our generation, I think you and I are probably similar age range, I would imagine. And we were all kind of, all of our shared experience comes through a television screen. And, it's really fascinating to look back and find out that all of the research that went into developing television and stuff like that was from the behavioral science chapter, or that's not the right word, but division of the Ford Foundation, like funding. So the Ford Foundation, Ford and Rockefeller foundations were probably the most predominant financiers of education initiatives. The Ford Foundation was almost 100% responsible for the development of the behavioral sciences that went into television programming. And it's hard for us to conceive, because we think of television programming as, what's on, but in reality, what's on is the programming. So television programming is just that,
It's programming the watcher.
Yeah, and we're engaged in these shared experiences and and there, again, just tremendous amounts of research went into this. And for a very long time, that experiment was kind of constrained to just a few shows, just a few channels. And then in the 80s, it kind of expanded out. And then, again, like you and I have never met each other, but I could probably make 100 references to movies that you've seen. And then we both share these memories and we share this. And now that's just, now we're on the cusp of a new generation that just has that amplified to the 100th degree, with the social media and whatnot. wow, it's just it's something else.
Yeah, it's almost a development of a monoculture that's based on these sorts of contrived entertainment vehicles.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, it's tough to say, like I don't know. It's hard to come off like, I don't want to come off like, oh well, the people who make the movies are responsible for or cognizant of the thoughts they are delivering, but
Mhm.
how we receive information is very important.
Hmm.
And then what information you don't receive through those mediums is very important. That's one of the reasons censorship was such a big deal for such a long time in this space. It's becoming a big deal again, but yeah, it's like, you don't even have to know what you're doing to it's like learning a new language.
Hmm.
You're participating in it without, you don't have to be a linguist to speak the language or to know what the root word is that you're using, because you're conveying a meaning and you're conveying a feeling and you're participating in the culture. But it's not, yeah, man, that's tough. It's tough to explain because it's just, my mind just races across all of these different references and I don't know which one to grab for you.
I know the feeling. So when you're saying how it's being conveyed is important, it's not just what's being conveyed, it's the process by which it's conveyed. And would you say a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, reinforcing behavior is often about group mentality. So like if you think about just like the having a studio audience, now granted there is the television shows did graduate into the, from, being live theater. So there was an audience. So of course, but if you think about, when the studio, especially now that a lot of the studio audience sounds you hear aren't even a studio audience, they play the laugh tracks to suggest, and it's like this whole group. It's like you feel like, okay, everyone else is laughing, so it's okay for me to laugh.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so you can reinforce that kind of behavior just through multiple exposures. You get to know what everyone's laughing at, then you try to replicate that behavior in class when you're kid. I'm at school doing the whatever I saw got laughs last night on In Living Color or whatever I was watching. So
Yeah.
It's weird because it's hard to tell if the culture is being driven or is driving the stuff. Like am I acting out the scene that I saw last night on television and that's driving me, or did the culture itself drive them to put that on television? And then it's such an interesting conversation to see where that circle begins and ends. And typically it doesn't. It just keeps recycling and recycling.
When you going back to when you were talking about the beginning of the compulsory education movement and the purposes of education and the critics of it, it's interesting to take that perspective. And the first time I really took that perspective, I've talked about this a little bit before, was when I picked up John Taylor Gatto's writings. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Yeah.
I just got familiar with him like about a year and a half. I want to say maybe close to 2 years ago. I can't remember, but I read one of his books and then listened to a book of lectures, and he was just amazing.
Dumbing Us Down, maybe.
I'd have to check which Audible it was, but fascinating,
really
and just
interesting,
inspirational too. I had turned him off like, man, this guy gets it. I'm not all out there by myself.
No, yeah, absolutely. And it sounds when you're describing the critics of the movement to educate it, this is kind of the first time I realized, wow, I've been a part of a process for a long time. It's not that education suddenly turned into indoctrination. It's that education, public education, has always been in order to serve a purpose of making citizens that will conform to their society. And you can look at that from a nefarious or malicious perspective, or you can look at it from a benevolent perspective. I think that there's one of the things that I've appreciated about how you talk about things is that you're not trying to bias your information very much. You're just really presenting the information. And when you pull back from these things and you imagine the people who, for whatever reason, have decided that they are responsible for the lives of other people, you can paint them as Dr. Evil cackling with a cat, or you can paint them as somebody who really thinks that they're a benevolent, force for good, and that's trying to make the best choices for the most people. And I think that it's really easy to take one perspective or the other, depending on where you sit. But anyway, so that the education is its purpose, this compulsory education program, is to create people who will conform to the culture of the moment, and
easier to manage
easier to
citizens.
manage.
Yeah.
I had this thought. I was traveling recently. I was at the airport, and going into the little line when you're about to do your TSA thing, check in.
Mm-hmm.
And they just suddenly diverted right in front of me, like, no, go over to this line. And then as I was walking around some new way to go through a new line, they're pulling these big tapes across to create new pathways and new like rat maze channels through this like long winding row of barriers. And I had this thought, this is all crowd control. And then we got up to the conveyor belt where you put your suitcase and your stuff. And I was watching as certain people were just auto selected for more screening. And I thought, this is just crowd control. They're just slowing down the lines. And how much of like the population management movement, as things have become more and more centralized, is just kind of this crowd control on a larger and larger level with people who think that they're in charge of other people.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. That's a great, yeah. Like, I mean, I don't know if that question is more rhetorical or not, like how many are actually out there, but I'm just taken back for a second on, that's your assessment is great. BF Skinner has some really excellent thoughts on this stuff. Not everything he says is, should be taken as the holy grail or anything, but one thing that he said that has always stuck with me is that control isn't about something playing out like a predetermined plan playing out. It's the contingencies we create that control the outcomes, or that produce the outcomes that we see in life. And that, that word contingencies is probably the most powerful word to understand like the current methods of control. It's, if how you can't make someone walk through a door. But if they do walk through a door and you make it to where they can't go back out that door, and they only have one other door to walk through, they have two choices. So you have a choice. You can stay in the room and you just live in that room now, or you go out that door. So those are the options.
Those are the tools.
Exactly. And you get stuck in this situation and just being alive. And I'm sure we've all felt like this, of like, man, I just work so I can pay these bills for this thing that I don't even feel like I need, but I need. And it's just if you feel like you have freedom of choice, try not doing what they want you to do, and see how easy your life gets, and then that's kind of what I always see and rebel against a little bit.
What's it's interesting when you're saying that. It makes me think of being a parent. And when one of my daughters was little, she refused to wear pants for a while. She wanted to wear dresses all the time. It had to be a dress. Nice. And so when it's cold outside and this kid won't wear, so we had this struggle over wardrobe. And the way that I manipulated her was to only give her a very small selection.
Yes.
Like, you get these 3 outfits, you can choose any one you want. And so it's kind of like this contingency thing. It's like I'm eliminating many of the choices that she could possibly pick from, because I want her to pick what I want her to pick.
Exactly.
And I'm not, if in that scenario, I'm not evil and I'm not trying to hurt her. I think I know what's best for her. And so I'm choosing what's best for her. And then I'm still offering her the illusion of choice, because she wants that. She wants to feel like she has some control. So I am as the benevolent dictator, trying to give the best outcome for the kid. And I wonder about the mindset of people who make decisions on a population level. I can't. I guess I'm just trying to like zoom out and see that. I've had this thought before. This thought, like, why do some people think that they can choose for other people entire life paths? Like, you think about the eugenics movement. I was just listening to your video this morning, The Great Rebalancing,
Oh, nice.
where you talk about Malthusianism, and you talk about you're showing there's this great video, and I think it's Rockefeller that's talking. What's this video? It's kind of in the middle of it, and they're having this conversation
At
where
the
17
67
countries.
conference. Oh
Is
yeah,
that what
yeah.
it was?
So yeah, it was the 1967 World Leaders Declaration on Population and Development.
Yeah, and they decide that in order to give aid to poor countries, these countries must sign on to a family planning, which is basically population reduction. They have to be willing to curb their population growth in order to
Yeah.
receive aid. And it's just fascinating to listen to these people make these decisions and the basis on which they do. They all seem very convinced that they're doing a really good thing by doing this.
Yeah, and to in their defense, a lot of those same people were in the room in 1947 when the population division was first assembled, and then like the first meetings I think happened in like 1949, where they had these conversations, because their moral high ground comes from they're the ones who are feeding you. So they're feeding the people, they're paying. The idea was that if they invest enough money to develop these countries, then once development happens, people will automatically select for less children. And then that didn't happen. And they're still investing all of this money. And now, the people that they paid to save, and that they're investing and saving all these people, now have more people. And now starvation is again at risk. And then anything that happens with the climate, or God forbid, there's a flood or something like that happens. And now the earth is supporting, 20 million more people in a location where it was struggling to support what it had before they started the programs. So from their perspective, they're kind of looking at it like a help me help you. Like I can't just feed an indefinite amount of people. We need to like if we can just cut the growth in half, we can get ahead of this thing. But you guys aren't helping me, so they kind of had to make it mandatory. And yeah, there's within that same group there are different motivations, so I can't speak for all of them. But to the majority of them, where we're talking about like when the World Bank got involved, and that was following the world leaders, and then from there it's kind of like a trickle into like then they formed the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, and then anyone who's running an agency basically gets this huge amount of money added to their budget every year if they adopt these policies. And so now education has to have this, and the other stuff, it's like it's like giving people development money for just letting an office be inside of your office. And now that they're operating with these same contingencies again. You can have the wheat, but you have to send your girl to school. And then if your girl goes to school, the education she's receiving is going to teach her the benefits of not having a kid. Outweigh your career.
And it's fascinating, and I feel like I need a much broader geopolitical education in order to really understand the backdrop for all of this. And so there's a million questions I could ask, and I want to go a lot of different directions, but just in terms of that teacher girl, the benefits of not having a kid, I feel like that's one thing that my eyes have become open to more recently, is how much of my cultural education has been this sort of David Attenborough-esque guilt for being alive as a human. There's this,
it's fascinating.
We are, it's just this, like, I can remember being a kid and getting these magazines, and you're reading about this animal or that animal that's endangered, and you go to bed just crying for the
and not only
kind
that,
of rhino, and you feel like I just should never have children. And
and they tell the kid, it's your responsibility to fix this. Like, tell your parents, do this. And it's so funny. They make education compulsory. And then their next byline is listen to the children. So first you
Yeah,
you have to let us educate your children. And then the
yes,
next one is just listen to the children. They know the
yeah,
way. And it's like, oh, funny that the people you just programmed to tell me,
yeah, yeah.
and parents actually do change their behavior more when it comes from the younger generation. It's
Mm,
fascinating. And a lot of thought went into this stuff.
mm,
And yeah, I mean, there's the geopolitical stuff, but then also I think what fascinates me the most, because it's more trackable, because with like the geopolitical, like the wars and everything that happens, there's so many moving parts. But when you pull that back to just like thought leaders or just like in academics, you can actually trace things a little bit better. So that's why
mm,
that's kind of like my safety zone, is I stay where people actually like, where I'm not like having to put together a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces or have the wrong
mm,
pieces inserted. You kind of just get to hear what these people were thinking, how they were thinking, how that developed into the next thing,
mhm,
and so on. And like this is all coming from the post World War. Basically, we're all just living in the world. World War I happened, and the second war was almost inevitable. Like a lot of people were saying it was inevitable, and then other people were saying you don't know what you're talking about. And then when it happened, all of the people who had been saying that it was inevitable, their stock went up,
mm,
and so they got a greater say in making sure it didn't happen again. And in the process of trying to make sure another great war didn't happen again, they got a tremendous amount of moral leeway and leverage. And the fact they were right about the second war was coming, just again, they were able to write their own ticket. And
mm,
that's what they did. And, one of the subjects of my study is Julian Huxley. And
mhm,
before America entered the war, he was actually on a speaking tour in America that he was sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation to come give a speaking tour. And his whole sales pitch for America getting into the war, because that's what he was trying to do, was get America involved in the war, was that telling them basically, you're going to miss your seat at the planning table for the new world. Like,
mm,
we're building a new world. And if you don't come help us, then you're not going to have a seat at the table in deciding. And that, and then while he was doing that tour, Pearl Harbor happened and all these things.
mm.
So, but that was the sales
Contingencies again.
pitch. Well, and it's just long-term planners doing what they do. He's written so much great stuff on this. He wrote one book on like the Tennessee. Oh man, I think it's called TVA, Adventures in Planning.
Okay.
And one of the things
Tennessee
that he's
Valley Authority.
yeah, you got it.
Uh,
And thank you for filling in the blank there. And
mhm,
his one of his arguments for the long-term planning is that these people that settled in that
mhm,
area had completely bungled all of their natural resources.
mm,
They had dammed up rivers that had tremendous downsides. They were inbreeding with one
mhm,
another because they didn't
mm,
properly plan all the. So he was using like how bad how people can get it wrong if you don't come in and set up the right criteria
infrastructure. Yeah.
for them to succeed.
Hmm.
And yeah, just it's a fascinating, but that gets into that whole trying to do what's best for them. And it's hard because who's them, and why do you think you know better than them?
Right.
But it is a hard argument to put down, like, well, they dammed a bunch of rivers and then they were starving because they did this thing and they didn't realize that there's going to
Hmm.
be 10 years and they don't understand ecology and how this stuff was operating. And
Hmm.
there's no like argument for like, oh well, they're people of the land, they know the land better than anyone, because that at that time that wasn't the case. They were just settling in a new territory
Hmm.
and trying to make that territory around how they wanted it. And whatever plans those people made for their short-term gains had terrible ramifications. And so it's fascinating stuff.
Hmm.
It's interesting to think about, and it's hard to say that they're wrong all the time, because just like your daughter should have pants on once in a while.
Hmm.
If it's cold, wear some pants. And she
Right.
doesn't know well enough to put the pants on for herself. And it's hard to like tell someone like, well, you don't know what's best for you. But I think we do encounter those people in life.
And
You know,
then the question becomes, when is it okay to infantilize someone? Because in the case of the child, clearly they don't have the developmental capacity to make those decisions for themselves. But with adults, should they be allowed to succeed and fail on their own, even en masse? Or is it some other human being's decision or responsibility to make decisions for populations of other people?
yeah, that's a really tough one. Especially, it's it's it was simpler in their era, because a lot of what they
And
were doing
when you
was,
say that, what do you mean? You mean the Huxley or the
yeah, in like
Rockefeller,
in the
the
Huxley, well,
early
that's all.
1900s or mid
Yeah, like the
1900s,
yeah, like the
mid-century?
early pre 1950, post 1950 is probably the
Okay.
best windows that you can get, and the pre 1950 is before all of the post-war development,
Hmm.
stuff where they were still, that's where eugenics was really huge, and the planning for society basically boiled down to, if you needed state assistance, then the
Hmm.
state got a say.
Yeah.
So when it came down to a point, like if you're a drunk living on the street and you're been getting locked up in the jail, and now it's all of these good citizens' responsibility to keep you alive, then
Hmm.
we get to say if you have kids or not.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's their thought
Eugenics.
process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was coming from that, like trying to strengthen the society as a whole and kind of
Well,
solve societal
and I won't
issues
say that
through
there's
these
not a
people.
good argument to be made for that. I can understand the logic behind that.
But it's tough at scale too, like you
Yeah.
said, because it's like, then you have also, these people do have kids, and then those kids, they're not guilty of their parents'
Right.
crime, and also people do have redemption arcs. There are
Yes.
some people in this world who had a really rough stretch for about 5 or 10 years, and then something changed, and they got back on track, and life got better for them. And there's also some of these, betters who uh, fell into, you know I
Hmm.
mean, the suicide rate after the first collapse was very telling of, like, just how people saw their value in society, and like what like the reflection on them having lost their money was now that they were of an inferior stock. And like, it was just such a heavy, wow.
Yeah. Like that cultural Darwinism kind of thing.
Yeah. And
So,
then, post 1950,
mhm,
it was just different. They just had a totally, like a re-innovated um structure. And a lot of that comes from the cybernetics movement, and
mhm,
just,
mhm,
the building of the United Nations, and the apparatus for a man, like a better management system that can come take over. And that it just then it stopped being about like trying to help countries build their own bureaucratic management structures, and just became about building your own management structure that will eventually be the best management structure, and may the best management structure win. And that's kind of where we've been at ever since, is the battle of the management structures.
mm. That's yeah, that's a nice simple perspective or simple way to phrase it. Um, uh, you know, so I don't know where you are on COVID or what your perspective was on that. I don't know that I've heard you specifically reference that, but one of the things that as I've been having discussions with people around social justice issues in education and psychology, and then if COVID comes up, I notice that some people see them all as linked to the same thing. Oh, this is all different control structures, different facets of the same machine. And then other people see them as completely different. No, social justice is this terrible thing that's being put on us, but COVID, that was really a scary virus, and our government just made a mistake with the way they managed it. I tend to side with the former. I tend to, for me, COVID always looked really suspect. The whole thing, from the very beginning, I did not like the way that this was being so heavily propagandized. And if it, but so I tend to be in the former camp where they all look like different tentacles of the same creature.
Yeah.
But as you know, you said with reference to like my daughter and the pants and like the making decisions for people that are intended kindly. If the social justice and all the division and all the fighting that this is causing, this identity politics, is just, I'm rambling a bit, but I guess what I mean is the COVID thing that drove a lot of fear into people, and it divided people. It also got a lot of people to take medications and medical interventions that have now shown to be really harmful to a lot of
Yeah.
people. The race baiting and the racial politics, the new framing of that is tearing people apart, tearing cities apart. The gender stuff is ripping families apart and causing kids to hate themselves and hurt their bodies. And I don't see how these are good. I don't see how anybody, if there is a they and this is a centralized thing, how is this a benevolent process? And what does that look like to you with your perspective on everything?
From where I'm sitting, and I am wrong about a lot of things, so I could be wrong about this, but the only way that it's all connected is in that sense of like everything is connected.
Mhm.
Everything is an interconnected system relating to itself.
Mhm.
But like even at a company, there are multiple divisions, and those divisions are operating with their own functions and for their own goals. And the company itself might be trying to achieve something in the market, like market
Mhm.
dominance or something.
Mhm.
Well, that might mean that your legal team is going after all of your competition and trying to shut them down and trying to do
Mhm.
this stuff. So when you're trying to shut down your competition, it's because you believe you have a superior product. So there, it can still get into that, like, oh, this is what's best for you, rationalization process. But it's like, COVID's such a loaded thing, because that's, from what I can tell, there was a lot of planning that went into what happened. So anything that there's a lot of planning that goes into, it's hard to say that it's like, whether you planned for it to happen or you planned it happening.
Right.
When there's like long trails of documentation and whole meetings where you're all sitting on a stage at a panel and discussing what you're going to do in this scenario, and then fast forward 2 years and that's what you're doing.
You do it just like that.
Yeah, it's not like so having a plan in place is kind of also what these people are getting paid to do.
Mhm.
But it's all of the other stuff that's underlying that. Like you have this, like this, like the weird, it's just such a complicated issue. And it's just so much to unpack. But like,
It is, and I don't necessarily mean to get into the weeds about whether the virus itself was a real thing or was engineered or whatever. I don't know. It seems like it was pretty real, and I don't really know enough about where it came from. I just mean the planning response.
yeah,
When you look at the
and
way that it looks again like more crowd control. It looks like that mass level crowd control. Like we're going too much here, so we're gonna do this to divert and create distractions. I don't know.
that specifically, COVID specifically, to me felt like a pressure test for a system that was built over a long period of time. And they were ready to see if they were ready to deal with a real situation. And I'm not saying that the situation itself wasn't real, but definitely the steps that it went through. And unlike a lot of people, like when they were having the first meetings where the FDA was, we're talking like November going into December, they were making these decisions based on no actual data. Like they had nothing. Like
Right.
even I think the meeting happened it was like December 17th or 18th. I would have to like
Of 2019 or 2020?
of 2020
Oh, 2020. Okay.
of them like deciding whether to roll out the vaccines and the stuff like that. And like, they have their expert panel on, and this is a 9-hour meeting, and I was painting a wall mural in my living room at the time, just like all
So
of
you're
us,
just
like
listening to that.
locked up. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I just
locked
had
down.
that on. And
Yeah.
and also, like, I'm in, management anyway, so I'm used to being in on long conference calls where I have nothing to say and I'm just hearing these, so I didn't have a job at the time. I'm doing my,
You're listening.
so I just
Yeah.
listened. And the thing is at the time I didn't have a dog in the fight, and I actually wasn't very far into that rabbit hole of research. But what really stood out to me was that they invited a panel of experts on,
Okay.
And that panel of experts had exactly zero answers or zero questions answered. Like
Hmm.
every single question they had was deflected, and every concern they raised was deflected. Look, I appreciate the guy who's running the meeting. I appreciate your concern, and I understand. And you know, you have an expert like, hi, yes, I think we all got the same data, and all I'm seeing is from all we have is up to October 18th or something. It's like over 2 months ago. He's like, is there any more updated data that we can get on this? Because it says that, so I basically only have a very small sample size, and it was only, you know, and the guy's like cutting him off like, hey, look, that's a very valid concern, and that's something we're going to get more information as this continues, but basically keeping the meeting on track. Like basically anything you're concerned about is going to get worked out in the wash. Don't really work. So I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so they had all of these experts on to not listen to their concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And then after not listening to any of their concerns and basically doing what they were decided to do, the meeting was just a formality. And
Mm-hmm.
having seen that and then seeing the reaction of everybody like, yeah, but the FDA said, and it was like, did you sit in on the meeting? Nobody. It was
Mm-hmm.
basically a marketing guy telling everyone who knows what they're talking about to shut up. I can't,
Yeah.
I couldn't, and that's really what sent me down that rabbit hole, was seeing how off that was. And then, yeah, then you find, you know, they had been working on basically like an updatable, what they're trying to do is get ahead of stuff. They want to be able to solve this stuff immediately. They want, if
Mm-hmm.
there's an outbreak in your community, that you get an
Mm-hmm.
update on an app, and then
Mm-hmm.
you can go get their new technology
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, and their vision is 20 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're right. I don't know. I mean, you know, Elon Musk knows a lot about technology, and he keeps weighing in on mRNA about how things are looking for the future, and you know, like this is a really good technology,
But
and
he's the
there's a
same
lot of
guy
people
whose like brain thing killed
who
somebody
wants
in
to.
its first Neuralink or whatever.
I didn't hear about that. That's
Oh, didn't
terrible.
it kill somebody right away
I
in its first
I
trial?
I don't know, but yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, that is how you figure things out.
I guess so.
It's, yeah, it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I don't, again, long view is always tough to tell, but
Mm-hmm.
in the short term, um, it mostly just seemed like compliance conditioning. They were conditioning compliance. And I think the scariest thing for me was that I had this faith in humanity that I got to watch just dissipate.
Yeah.
And like I got to watch the dehumanization phase, and I got to watch all this stuff. And all the time I'm trying to be that guy without a dog in the fight and just
Yeah.
kind of watch. And I got totally radicalized because I was just like seeing these people celebrating when someone, you know, it's just that was the worst. That was the worst of it. That was really bad, was watching what people did to one another throughout that whole process of like like even, you know, like the person who raised me and was like the kindest and most gentle soul I've ever met on this earth. Um, like, you know, she took me in. I was a homeless kid, and I had nowhere to go. And she's just taught me how to love people and how to be a good person. She like cut off a bunch of friends because they didn't get the vaccination,
Yeah.
and was like, you know, and it's like,
Yeah.
it was just crazy to see this person who I thought was like just this pinnacle of acceptance and
Yeah.
beautiful, what a person could be. And she was just like totally programmed, and was just
Yeah.
like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to Thanksgiving this year. And, you know, you can forget me at Christmas too. And, you know, basically like told him to F off. And it's like,
Yeah.
these are lifelong friends of hers. And it's like, wow, it was jarring. I
It
think that
is
was another wake
jarring.
up moment.
Yeah, that's really sad, and I think that that story, there's so many people with similar stories, and I have stuff like that that happened in my family also. There's relationships that aren't as close as they were before because of
Right.
things like that. And I think um one of the things that occurs to me with that is that there's this refusal to admit to flaws in human nature, or potentials for dishonesty, or that it's like there's this refusal to take a look at for instance, with if we're talking about to the COVID thing, the shot or whatever.
Uh-huh.
I can understand people saying, I want to choose that. I think that's what I'd like to choose. It sounds, I'm worried about the virus. I'm convinced by the people I've heard. and I'm going to choose that. But then there's this, like, even when presented with certain information, this refusal to even admit that that other information exists. It's similar to that committee you're talking about, where people are raising really good questions and they're just sort of dismissed out of hand, and the decision has already been made. And it seems like that's on some level a refusal to admit that there could be flaws, or that there could be other factors. And so it's like a la la la, I won't look at the dark side of human nature. I won't look at the potential for there to be control mechanisms being put into place that are not about what they say they're about. It's not about there's only 3 outfits in the closet. It's about I want you to wear pants, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, like, do you think that in the case of your relative that you're talking about, is it something like that? Is it like, I have to believe this, because if I don't believe this, there's a lot of my faith that's going to fall apart?
I think it comes down, and I might be wrong, but I think a lot of this comes down to self-preservation. You
Okay.
know, whatever that
It's like
same
genuine buying into the fear,
and just genuinely self-deception, like the
self-deception.
same instinct that, you know, will make a tiny dog bark at a bear or a bigger dog. Like in his mind, he's got a chance. You know, he's got, so it's like this weird mechanism that kicks in. It's almost like survival, you know, and in fact, a good survival mechanism would be to tell them to run away from this thing, but they have to like convince themselves that what they did was right. And like, I don't know. I think once you've already made a decision, it's really difficult to shake yourself away from that. And that's where people really start the justification process. Or if they've already decided that something is for the greater good, like the guy who's leading the meeting knows that there's going to be downsides. But look, people, if we focus on the downsides, nothing would get done. Let's focus on the positives and let's keep, you know, and it's like this weird.
But there's something so psychopathic about
process.
knowing that the downsides are lives that are being destroyed.
Yeah.
And how do people get to the point where they feel like they have the ability and the right to make decisions that destroy lives? And that's utilitarianism. I mean, that's really what
it's
that is.
The weight of the greater good. Yeah, they're trying to compare what they believe will be a beneficial outcome. I mean, it's the old omelet and eggs, you know, and it's just how bad you want the omelet, I guess. I don't know. It's tough. Yeah, that's going to be one that I hope gets unpacked eventually. There are a lot of good people doing a lot of good work right now. And luckily there's a lot of good stuff coming to the surface. I'm one of those, like, I have to wait like 5 years to see what actually shakes out of it before I can make a full assessment. But I'm really grateful for all the people who are doing like frontline work on this stuff and, like, you know, questioning, and there's a lot of people who've lost their careers and they've lost their good name, and they've
been canceled.
Yeah.
I kind of want to ask you about what it means to be radicalized, but I also want to ask you, in your opinion, based on your research and your perspective, is the gender ideology, the comprehensive sex education that comes straight out of UNESCO and is filtered through all these different school programs all at once, that's pushing alternative sexual identities and asking children and encouraging them to try on transgender identity, is this Malthusian? Is this population control?
No. Well, I mean, I can't say no. What I was saying no to is and this is, I'm sorry to be like technical about this stuff, but like, Malthusian is kind of like a blanket term that gets splashed across control, but Malthusian isn't about control. It's about predictive. It's about it's economic predictions of eventual outcomes. So it's predictive models being applied at scale. That's Malthusianism. Neo-Malthusianism, it's called it was called Neo-Malthusianism specifically because Malthus didn't believe in artificial controls. Like he didn't, like his from his perspective, not having like children or continence in marriage was the what, like, you're making a choice to do something. He didn't believe in, like, like, he was actually
Okay.
opposed this stuff from like a religious perspective.
No, then that's a really good distinction to draw out.
Yeah, so then later in the 1877 era is where like the Neo-Malthusian League and like these people kind of grew out of this of now they're trying to prevent the problems from happening by addressing them before they become problems. Start lowering the birth rate in the poor communities, and soon you'll have less poor people. Less poor people means less poverty, more abundance, and then it scales up from there. But I don't it's
so
really tough.
is this part of an antinatalist movement, or is it something that's just emerging and people really think this is for the best, for some other reason?
A little column A and a little column B, and then also just a little bit of culture has been commandeered, for lack of a better term, for the last couple generations. And so we're now well into the late stages of a very, at the early stages of UNESCO, it was about creating a one world mind and a one world culture that celebrated diversity. Genetic diversity and all forms of diversity are great, but celebrated them within the scope of the one world vision. And that was, we're talking.
Isn't that a little oxymoronic in a way?
I mean, yeah, yes and no. It's like it's so difficult because we're talking about a totally different time period of, you have some people who are like flying around in planes and have all this technology and stuff, and then you have other people who are basically living in the Stone Age, and like at the same time on the same continent. It's just I mean, when Mussolini bombed Africa, he's literally flying planes bombing people with spears. It's like a game of Civilization or something. It was just a totally, so like the whole point was that the whole world just got conquered. So what they needed to do was preserve these cultures that they just conquered. It's almost like if you think about like museums and like why you have a museum is so that you can look into the past and you can see. So they're trying to preserve multiculturalism, is trying to preserve and not conquer and like replace. So what they were trying to do was avoid being bad guys. And what they're in their mind, what bad guys were doing was going in and just wiping out a culture and then supplant, putting in the Anglo culture, and now you are raised in our schools and tradition is forgotten. They wanted to try to educate the people, but also maintain some sense of where they're at. But what ended up happening is the first generation who, if you look at like education, like a garden, like which is that's what educators look at it as, or the early educators look like I think the kindergarten is actually like child garden is like how that actually, and it's like, so they're good. The first crop that they grew in this new multiculturalist garden is kind of where you get into the cultural revolutions that happened in the 60s. And so you get this crop of people with these ideas that have been very specifically programmed into their mind, and then they're creating their own gardens from that. And then it's what these people grew that is kind of what we're dealing with today. Then you get, another 20 to 30 years out from that. Wow. That's when you start seeing the results of.
So it's like sort of dominoes. It's like you set it in motion and then you watch it fall.
Exactly. Okay. And if it's not falling in place, then you have a backup plan for what you're going to do to get that domino to fall. And again, just like dominoes, it doesn't have to be, you can build, one long trek that's going in one direction, and then I can actually build my trek off of yours, so that when one block falls from yours, it knocks into one of mine, and now mine are going in the same direction, but in a different path. So it's like, we're looking at like, there are different things at play. Like there's cultural Marxists that are completely trying to uproot society and change all this stuff. And then there's people who are just like, man, like just trying to do what's right. And like, they have no ill intentions or anything like that. They're just, the way they've learned to understand things is in this very doesn't exist environment. It's almost like for like something I want, like an image I want to create sometime, if I can figure out how to capture it. It's like when I was a kid, it was really big for like teachers to tell us like the only reason people can't fly is because someone told you can't, or something like that.
Okay.
And it's like, yeah, so if someone, I think, man, I'm probably butchering this, but it was basically like, if no one ever told you that you couldn't fly, what's to tell you that you can't fly? Like, could you fly? Maybe you can fly and you've just always been told you can't fly.
Wow.
So like the whole teaching idea was to never tell children that they can't do the stuff. Or like that they can't, like you can be anything you want to be, you can do it. Whereas before that, the previous generation was like, all right, well, Bobby's never going to be a surgeon. Okay. Let's figure out what Bobby's going to do for a living. And ours was a totally different, like, yeah, you can do it. And now it's even more delusional to where now, they've got all these kids that are just flying off the cliff thinking that they're going to grow wings. And what ends up happening is just a bunch of lemmings. And they just all go down and they're going to crash. And it's just terrible to see, but it comes from a good idea turned into a misinterpretation or a weird interpretation with a good intention. And then you have this whole other sect of this universe that just grows and develops with a crazy mindset. I don't know how people got to a point where mutilating children is a good idea. Or where you have this like it used to be like, I just can't fathom telling a parent that you need to do this thing or your kid's going to kill yourself or kill themselves. And it's like, I feel like I would want to fight that person for putting that idea into my kid's head, for even saying like, that this is an option. Like, oh yeah, is your parent not giving you what you want? You know what you got to do next. This is your power. You got to take your power.
Yeah.
And it's just such a
really
weird perversion of the listen to your kids.
I had a doctor do something kind of similar to that with me, with my daughter, when she was, my older daughter's asthmatic and had a lot of trouble with medical stuff when she was a kid. And she was having this terrible asthma attack one time. And I had just been assigned a new doctor per my insurance that I had never met before. And I was on state insurance because I was a poor single mom.
Right.
And so I go in and this new doctor he was extremely condescending and he's trying to give her some medication. And I wanted to understand the medication. I just said, will you tell me what it is? We haven't, she's what, 9-10 years old. And we had seen lots of doctors. She was seeing a pulmonologist. We'd taken lots of drugs, but this was one I'd never heard of. And I want to know what he's giving her. And so in front of my kid, he said, Mom, your daughter could die. And you're going to question me about the medication? Just give her, he's just like selling me.
Wow.
This, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And right in
wow.
front of her. And you can see her, and she's having an asthma attack and he's withholding treatment until I wanted to know, why can't we just give her albuterol or one of the other drugs that I'm used to being given when I bring my kid in? And he strong-armed me by telling me in front of my kid that she could die and like refusing my questions about side effects and what this drug is. So it feels kind of like that. Like when you hear these parents talk about the scenario where they're sitting with their kid's in obvious distress. And the doctor comes in acting as if they're an agent of the child. I'm on your child's side. Your child is in dire need, but now they're terrifying the kid and they're putting an idea in the kid's mind that maybe wasn't there prior.
Yeah.
So
and all because they prefer some drug and they don't feel like describing why they prefer
options.
it. Yeah.
What are the other options?
Because he
for
took
treatment?
me to dinner last week. All right. And that's none of your business. You want your daughter to die or not? Oh man, that's
pretty
infuriating.
much. Pretty much. Yeah. It is
Infuriating.
infuriating. And hearing people be manipulated this way is really, it's an abuse of power for sure.
It's brutal.
But it all comes back to abuse of power in a way, if you want to take that perspective. Like, what do I have the right to know all the details about my situation that somebody with a different perspective can see? Do I have the right to make a decision for myself? Do I have the right to to have the maximum amount of autonomy, or should I be channeled through that TSA line in a certain way because they've decided, and they, the contingencies are there. And so from zooming back out, who's they in this scenario? Is they just that group of people who were coming together post-war or pre-war and trying to make decisions, and they set these dominoes into place a long time ago, and now it's just successive generations of management? Or is there a larger they that still has a picture of what's best for the population at large?
Well, like coming from the scenario we were just talking about, it's hard to say like, well, which they were speaking on, but like from like a greater like zoom out macro they, it's typically the people who control the resources. So what we're talking about basically, and it's nothing radical, it's just people with generational wealth think long term. They just think about things differently, whereas
different arc.
Yeah, you and I are budgeting for our year or maybe our month. They're trying to plan enough so that we have a vacation. They're trying to plan enough for multiple generations of their family to be able to sustain certain comforts and different things and accomplish different goals. So they're just thinking with a much longer view. And there was also this whole, when we circumnavigation really changed things, because when people were able to change or to go over to different cultures and see how they think and see, like Rockefeller was one of the first people to do business in China. And China had extremely long view planning in mind at the time. They would, same way most of Asia had this really long view planning approach.
The dynastic approach.
Yeah, and when you're coming into, and when you bring that back over to like a bustling industrial nation that's growing every 10 years, it's just developing in a tremendous pace, and you apply that long-term thinking, things just changed. So like with the medical industry, that's primarily going to be, most of the medical boards and stuff like that, it's a huge oversimplification, but you're basically getting into Rockefellers. The Rockefeller Foundation is almost 100% responsible for this stuff. The Rockefeller Research Institutes and the from the fundings of other schools like John Hopkins, or the whole idea of research universities in general. Like all of that stuff comes from these people, and then their children, like David Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller III, are the two primary from the third generation of Rockefellers, who they took over the management transition. So the change in management was basically discovering a new way to manage people in a more productive fashion. And then also they understood that the world has to be internationalist. Otherwise, there's going to be conflict. So they needed to set up new trade, new different, and for a business to work on multiple continents and in multiple cultures, there has to be a shift in how things are done. And there was just so many innovations at the time that they were able to start implementing them. And they both talk about it in their autobiographies. So like in David Rockefeller's autobiography, that's a really good one. He talks about like how basically they reformed the NIH and they, who they put in front of it, and how they centralized science so that they could have more control over what was happening. So they actually changed all the scientific criteria before that of like what went into this stuff to streamline the process. And at the time, he was also the head of Chase Bank. So he took Chase and made it into the first financial credit institution. And they did all this stuff, and they did all this funding, and they had everything from like bribes to, it's all in the book, and he explains it. And then on the other side of that, you got his brother, who's John D. Rockefeller III, who's the eldest, and he was the one that was kind of spearheading the whole population movement since the very beginning. And he basically traveled with he was working for the League of Nations kind of like as a internship, and did a trip to Asia and just saw what was happening with overpopulation, and it just changed him. And he was convinced from a very young age that this is the problem of our era. And that's just the direction he moved ever since, and ended up founding the Population Council and organizing the meeting that got all the international population controls in order. And then, like you saw later, he was at the conference. He's the one who, it's his signature on the World Leaders Declaration of Population and Development. That wasn't a UN document. He drew that up together, got all the world leaders in a room, made them sign the document so that there could no longer be the excuse of like diplomats not having any authority. Because if you have all of the leaders in agreement and you have permission from the boss, now you can hold them taking to that action. And so we have this whole different rollout structure. So that changed the entire momentum of the UN. And that's where the UN actually got into long-term planning strategies as well. Because before that, they were more just implementing, the UN was kind of a conglomerate of different organizations, like the Food and Agricultural Organization and other institutions who had pre-existed the UN and had their own way of doing things. And the 60s was really where they kind of unified them into like, okay, well, we're gonna make a decision. Based on that decision, we're gonna have 5 years of deliberation where we do all of our research and we gather all of our reports and we do all this. And then in 5 years, we'll meet back and we'll discuss what the best route of. That way, they're no longer arguing about what the best thing to do at these conferences is. We all had 5 years to do our research. Bring your solution, and then when we leave here, we're going to have a solution, and then 5 years later, we're going to touch back on that solution. And it's just these 5-year increments of 20-year plans, and that's really all it is. It's just generational planning. And they did the same thing again with business. Like I said, so that's what John D. Rockefeller III's doing. At the same time, you have Chase Bank, who's implementing all of these new management strategies. And as David Rockefeller explains, like it's all cutting edge stuff. And that's why they're so far ahead of their competition. And that's even where you get like the WEF and stuff from. It's from this new management renaissance. And the introduction of computers really changed that. And that's where like, before it was the World Economic Forum, they were the European Management Forum, I want to say. And that was like, 1973 or 1970, somewhere in the 1970 to 1973 range is where they first had their meetings. And it was basically like predictive modeling using computers to see what the economies would be like in these different business sectors. So they were just people, they were like businessmen figuring out how to do business in the new world. And the people who were first to figure it out had better positions moving forward, and then that gained traction, and then soon you just got this weird amalgamation of different mega corporations combining and growing. And what they were really doing was they were growing, like the superior management structures were absorbing the less, and it was just this whole extra this new food system
centralizing.
Yeah, and then you get to the point where the people with the best management systems now own all of the food. So it's like if you want, Nestle owns most of the world's fresh water.
Wow.
Yeah, so when you break down like who's they, it's hard because Nestle is a huge company, but like the people who own the fresh water have a say in what happens.
Right.
And then the people who own the agricultural, who own the most land that is actually cropland and stuff, they have a say in what happens. And those are the people that you find have a say. And those are usually the people with immense, like multi-generational wealth. And the OGs are no longer even the main players in that field. Like the Rockefellers and stuff, they're still, the foundation is what it is. And their institutions and everything is all world class with the Rockefellers, but it's no longer like their pioneering days are over, and it's just into a new era of people. And fascinating stuff.
Oh, it really is fascinating. It's really interesting. And the more I've thought about this, the more I've come to see centralization as a very dangerous thing for individuals, because the more we're centralized, the less we're treated. I mean, you can even just think of a school with a small number of students versus a giant school that has thousands of students. The way the kids are treated is very different. It's just this human resources mindset that kind of treats people like
you
like
use the
something
perfect
subhuman.
word. Yeah, actually, human resources is that's the movement. Like that was the biggest shocker for me is I always knew the revolution would come. I just didn't think it would enter through the human resources department. And
Huh.
that's what happened. And you can
Wow.
actually, there's a book, it's written in, I want to say 1973, John D. Rockefeller III. It's called The Next American Revolution or Second American Revolution, something like that. But it's just about the human resources revolution. And he says everything is plain as day. Yeah, he draws everything out and explains that if he doesn't take control and implement humanistic purposes as the driver, then the technocratic people are going to take over, and they're going to have technocratic requirements. So it's basically the humanists versus the technocrats.
Oh, interesting.
And then there was like this weird merger of those people at a certain point, and that's kind of where we're at now, to where like the humanists and the technocrats are almost indistinguishable. But that wasn't the case then, so it's a really interesting artifact. He's a very dry writer, and he's not a great writer, but there's a lot of great information in there.
Well, I guess that's why it's so good to have people who are willing to distill some of that, so that people who aren't willing to sit down with it, like myself, can benefit from the videos and the instruction. Yeah.
There you go. Well, I'll make a video about it. I'll just do some light reading selections.
Thank you. That would be very nice.
Try to read them to a little music or something.
Wow. Well, it's really interesting. And you know, when you think about the structure of the they, and you see the World Economic Forum and these folks that are flying around in these fancy planes telling all of us to stop traveling. And, you know, I can't help but wonder.
They all travel to the most remote place.
It's like the biggest hypocrisy, you know. You've got to stop traveling while we travel, like, you know,
to Davos,
decadently,
of all places.
Decadently.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
But it seems like it's just the age-old battle for resources, and they've used their wits to sort of create the resource acquisition that they want and do it a different way. It's a clever sort of way.
People with daily concerns aren't going to be able to keep a long view.
Yeah.
Like if you have short-term worries, you know, luckily I finally made it to a point in my life to where I don't have to worry about where my next meal's coming from and stuff. When I was working 3 jobs, I had no time to do any of this stuff. And now that I'm in a position where I can actually sit back and reflect or sit down and read a book, you know, that's something I just couldn't. So it's really not it's a very pitched game.
Yeah.
You know, they have a very, and we have such short-term memories as people anyway. The next thing that happens will make you almost complete. It's almost like your mind can only hold so much stress and concern and stuff. And then when something big happens, everything else just etch-a-sketches out of it. And now this becomes your new focal point. And it's like the meme of it is like the next thing or next current thing or whatever it is.
Current thing,
but
enjoyer.
And that's supporter. Really, but that's a real thing. That's just a human characteristic. We're reactive.
And then I don't know if this is what you mean when you say radicalized, but there's a way in which I've started to see things as they come up. I'm like, well, there it is again. There's the same thing again here. What's the flavor of the month crisis? Because it feels like I'm being invited to get into a reactive mindset instead of a contemplative, responsive mindset, you know, which is
and actually punished for, if you say like, I need more information before weighing people, mid-wit or something. Like since when is having to think about things a sign of, but when I was saying radicalized, there was something that happened where I think I noticed my moment where I was being radicalized was one, I was like mainlining Twitter. Like I was like stressed out about stuff. And for some reason I was going to the place that was the source of all my stresses to like decompress. And that was bad. But I had a business meeting with someone and they had to reschedule because they were taking their kids to get vaccinated. And I didn't want to do business with that person anymore after hearing that they were getting their kids vaccinated. And I was just like, I felt like, okay, well, that's a point of radicalization. I think when I'm making like life decisions about someone else who's making a decision in their own life, I don't know. It was kind of like a line I was drawing, but I drew it out of this place of like disgust. and
Yeah.
anger. And
Like
anytime I feel,
you were channeled into, there was narrative, and then you're being channeled into counter narrative, and you're really buying it just as deeply as the narrative people are.
yeah, and I can't think less of this guy because this
Right.
is the decision he doesn't have. It's just it is that's kind of where
Mhm.
I realized, like, okay, maybe
Mm.
I need to pull back and just reassess before, because it starts changing who you are as a person a little bit. And once I feel like visceral responses, like if it like makes me disgusted, a lot of times I react in that moment with
Mhm.
whatever that response is, but I contemplate that later, and it just sometimes it just doesn't sit right with me to
Mhm.
just have those. Like, you really got to think, where did that feeling come from?
Mhm.
Could it possibly be that you're like clockwork oranging yourself all day on this application?
Yeah. Wow,
Yeah,
that's a
this
great way to describe it.
oh,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I felt like I
Yeah.
was doing. So I really had to take a step back from. I also felt like and this is nothing against people who do really cool things on Twitter, and I like Twitter for what it is and stuff, but there's this thing that when you feel like you're when you feel like participating in the conversation or posting
Mhm.
something, is
Mhm.
you when you confuse that for actually doing something,
Mm.
what happens is your body is like, all right, well, I just did something, or
Mhm.
I'm doing something, and you're really not doing anything.
Right.
So I'm
Yeah.
trying to like get myself into a place to where I don't. It's the same way, like I try not to talk about big projects, I try to do them, because like the
Oh, yeah.
act of talking about something, people are like, oh, that's really cool, and then when you get that positive
Yeah.
feedback, it almost gives you the same sense of accomplishment.
Yeah.
I can't do that, otherwise I won't actually do the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. And
Oh,
that's,
that
I
makes
just
a
try to
lot of
keep my
sense.
focus on real life stuff.
Being aware of that process inside. I
Yeah.
heard you talk about something. I think it was one of your conversations with Benjamin Boyce about um, the respect that you have for people who are able to change their minds and admit
Yeah.
when they've taken a position that they no longer hold. And I thought
Yeah.
that's great. I agreed with you. I liked the way that you described that mental flexibility uh, and I think that it's kind of what you're describing now, being able to observe yourself having a really visceral bias and then checking in with that and sort of like investigating that a little more deeply.
Yeah, you have to, otherwise, you stop growing. And if
Mhm.
you stop growing, you're basically, in the process of dying. It's like a weird, like, I don't, that's probably not right, but that's just kind of how I think about it. It's just how
Mhm.
I just always try to keep moving forward in that direction. I let myself down constantly, but I definitely I try my best.
Well, I think that what you said, not when you stop growing, you're in the process of dying. In my mind, I have this image that I have about rigidity versus flexibility, and you can think of a plant like a plant when it's young and delicate and it's green and it has that bendy flexibility versus as it starts to get old near the end of its life cycle, it'll
Pardon.
become woody and rigid and brittle. And so I, I I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it's
No,
it's a
yeah.
mental image that I get that fits
No,
really
it's a
well
great
with what
one
you
too.
said.
They use that in
Yeah.
like martial arts a lot, like be the
Okay.
willow. And
Oh
it's like,
yeah.
because you can
Nice. Can
withstand the,
flow. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of stuff.
Well, Jason, I'm really glad I got to speak with you today, and I'm glad we got to kind of wander through these topics a little bit because it's something that has, like I said, it's come up. People want to talk about, where does this come from? Is it emergent? Is it just organic, or is it being planned? And from this conversation, it's clear it's very nuanced. It's a very complex, like
Little
what
column A, little column B.
yeah, what the growth of culture and the people who
Yeah,
nudge it and the people who exercise power over it, and also the way that that we function within it. It's all very complex. And
absolutely.
I really encourage people to check out your videos because they're very well done, and I'm looking forward to watching more of them. And thank you
Well,
for what you're doing.
well, thank you for what you're doing, and thank you so much for having me on. And it was so nice talking with you today.
Well, it's really great talking with you too. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.